Welcome to our lecture on total revolution in Russia. In our previous lecture, we had considered the impact of total war as the First World War transformed societies and domestic politics of the combatant nations. In today's lecture, we'll examine how total war led to a new kind of political upheaval, an attempt at total revolution, claiming to usher in an entirely new era in human history in the case of the first great empire to collapse as a result of the strains of the First World War, the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was battered by total war as military disaster led to increasing social disintegration. One thing was clear to contemporary observers: in spite of the onset of modernization in economics and to a lesser degree in politics in previous decades in the Russian Empire before 1914, Russia was unprepared for the rigors and the demands of a total war and total mobilization. To contemporaries, Russia's agrarian autocracy seemed fatally backward. Backwardness was a word that was often used in discussing the Russian Empire these days, backward both in economics and in politics. In economics, its agrarian structure was still remarkably primitive by comparison to that of other developed economies. Industrialization, while making remarkable leaps forward in the previous decades, had not yet led to the sort of level of industrialization that was common in other Western countries. And in politics, the rule of the Tsar, an emperor who ruled as he believed by divine right, seemed synonymous in the eyes of many educated Russians with the backwardness of their imperial structure. These dissatisfactions would grow into a rejection of the system as social and indeed ethnic fractures in this multinational, multi-ethnic empire expanded during the course of the war as part of the strains of that phenomenon of total war. At first, in 1914, many Russians, and indeed even members of other ethnic groups in the Russian Empire, had shared in some of that enthusiasm which we have remarked upon for August 1914. As crowds swelled in the capitals of Europe, so too in the former St. Petersburg, soon renamed Petrograd, in order to make it sound less German, crowds had gathered to celebrate the advent of the war. Intellectuals and political parties supported the war and hoped that it might be a modernizing, liberalizing influence upon their own state. There was, however, a party that resolutely opposed the war, and they were the Bolsheviks. Radical socialists led by Lenin from exile were uncompromising in their determination. And indeed, their perspective, their assurance that this conflict was doomed to failure was soon vindicated by what was to be seen on the battlefield. Military failure and scandal undermined the court, especially after the Tsar himself took command of the armies in 1915 personally. According to military historians and political historians of Russia, this was a disastrous stroke because it took away from the Tsar his deniability. It associated him personally and his dynasty with the failures of the war as it unfolded. Indeed, it was clear on the battlefield of total war that Russia was not in a position to supply even its own troops. There's one anecdote in particular which makes this dreadfully clear. In the case of the fighting on the Eastern Front of Europe between the Russians and the Germans, there were cases of Russian soldiers who were not even given rifles before being moved up to the front. They were told by their generals not to worry. They should simply advance to the front line where they heard the guns booming, and when they would encounter the bodies of dead Russian comrades, they were to grab the rifles that they would find on the ground and move forward. One needs to imagine the sort of fury that would start to grow slowly, even in the proverbially patient Russian peasant soldier, at the notion that his life was being toyed with and counted for so little in such a conflict. Dissatisfactions of this sort, the increasing erosion of confidence in the Tsarist regime, then led to the February Revolution. On February 23rd, 1917, March 8th by the Western calendar that was not yet in use in Russia, the February Revolution broke out in the capital of Petrograd. It started from causes that seemed small enough, the protests of ordinary women demanding food for their families, which soon were joined by troops who had been sent to quell them, grew into a larger revolt. It took on a momentum of its own, and a new democratically oriented provisional government took power within the Russian Empire. The Tsar and his family were arrested, and the provisional government promised new liberties, new rights, a new regime within Russia, the advent of democracy, it was hoped. In the minds of these revolutionaries, one prior revolution was very present to mind, and that was the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century that we had discussed in an earlier lecture. They hoped to get it right, to replay some of the events of the French Revolution, which had become a model for such transformation, and to move in a direction that was positive, to move towards democracy and the consolidation of the rights that they promised. A question that was present to mind for them was, might their revolution also degenerate into a reign of terror, as had been the case in the French Revolution? At the same time as the provisional government was vesting its hopes in a democratic form of governance, there was also another center of authority, another competing rival institution known as the Petrograd Soviet. The Soviet claimed to speak for many other Soviets throughout the country. Now, Soviets were simply grassroots councils. They were forms of, it was theorized, popular democracy. Councils that were established by ordinary soldiers, sailors, and workers to rule themselves. This was taken to be, in many ways, a much more popular and grassroots form of democratic organization than the liberal-led government, the provisional government. In the period that followed, the Petrograd Soviet, claiming to speak for all of the other grassroots Soviets throughout the empire, would challenge the authority of the provisional government, and one would have an odd situation of dual power. Precisely because of the commitment of the provisional government to its democratic allies in the West, the Great Britain and France, Russia remained in the war. This was probably fateful for the demise of their revolution. Instability continued within Russia. The longing for peace soon created a situation which the Bolsheviks could exploit. Lenin was returned by special train from his Swiss exile, a trip through Germany passing into the Russian Empire, facilitated by the German High Command, which hoped that Lenin would spread a message of revolution. They thought of it in terms of infecting the Russian Empire with the virus of revolutionary ideas, which would destabilize the war effort. Lenin was not a German spy, as some believed or charged at the time, but Lenin was certainly happy to oblige the plans of the German military dictators for his own revolutionary purposes. On his arrival in the Russian capital of Petrograd, Lenin announced ringingly to his supporters and all others in the crowd gathered to meet this remarkable revolutionary, the so-called April Theses. The April Theses argued there should be no support for the provisional government. It represented an older liberal form of government that would be surpassed. Instead, in another ringing slogan, all power should go to the Soviets. These councils should form the basis for a new form of government. And Lenin then announced a very appealing slogan, which was far simpler and far easier to understand for the masses than the abstract liberal ideology of the provisional government. The appealing and simple slogan of bread, peace, and land. Bread, peace, and land expressed precisely the longings of a population that was finished psychologically with the rigors of war. Lenin had support from his Bolshevik group, and he was also supported by other remarkable individuals who flocked to the cause. Among them was a fervent revolutionary and an inspiring revolutionary orator in the tradition of the French Revolution, Leon Trotsky, who was a Russian revolutionary who had recently returned from exile in New York on hearing news of the revolution, and who joined the Bolsheviks in the summer of 1917, becoming one of their most important leaders. We need to pause for a moment to consider the background of this remarkable revolutionary, Lenin, and the machine for revolution which he built up, the vanguard party, as it was called, of the Bolsheviks. Lenin was not Lenin's real name. It was rather an assumed revolutionary name. He was born Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov in 1870. He was born of middle-class origins. His father was a school inspector, giving him the status of approximately the lower nobility in the structure of the Russian Empire. Lenin's youth, however, was shaped by one traumatic experience above all. His admired older brother, in 1887, was executed because of his political activities. It was charged that he was a terrorist. Lenin was seared by this experience. He rejected traditional religion. One anecdote suggests that at that moment of loss of faith, Lenin literally tossed a cross into the garbage, expressing his complete break with earlier beliefs. He denounced liberalism, believing it to be a weak and irresolute, hopeful ideology, and instead turned towards radical revolutionary politics of the sort that his admired brother had also pursued with a remarkable single-mindedness. Contemporaries and friends of Lenin's used to say about Lenin that they had rarely met a man so focused upon his desires. Lenin lived the future revolution. He tended not to speak much about himself, but seemed to have given over his entire being to the aim of the revolution that was to come. Some suggested that Lenin had turned himself into a perfect weapon or machine for revolution. He would start the day with the reading and underlining of many newspapers and would pass on to frenetic and organized, efficient revolutionary activity. Living as a revolutionary now, living for the revolution, he took the revolutionary name of Lenin. He was soon arrested in 1896 for his political activities and was exiled to Siberia. Exile to Siberia under the Tsarist regime was not the harsh sentence that it often would become in the times of the Soviet Union. Exiles could often hope to spend their time in settlements studying or writing or thinking. The way in which Siberian exile would become a literal death sentence was yet to come. From 1900 to 1917, Lenin lived and worked outside Russia in exile and never lost hope in the coming of the revolution that he heralded. He set about organizing a secret society of professional, underground revolutionaries who'd be joined in an iron commitment to a set of common ideals. Committed to Marxist socialism, this vanguard party, as he called it, because it would be in advance of the masses, leading the masses, showing them the way, was to be marked by a distinctive structure that would allow it to organize underground, a structure of so-called underground cells. These cells, smaller parts of a larger revolutionary organism, would give it coherence, but would also mean that it would be harder to break up because its organization would be secret and centralized in such cells rather than in one essential center that could be knocked out. Such a professional revolutionary party would also have to be marked by an enormous internal discipline. To this end, Lenin and his colleagues coined a somewhat odd phrase called democratic centralism to express the dynamics of their own party on the inside. Democratic centralism was the idea that within this professional party, discussion about tactics should be free, should be open, should be, in a sense, democratic. But however, once the leadership of this party, after taking into consideration the voices and the ideas of the professional revolutionaries that made it up, once the leadership had decided upon the course of action, the time for discussion was over. At that point, centralism would kick in. And this elite professional party of revolutionaries would then act with one will, with one commitment, and with enormous professionalism towards its revolutionary goal. In the name of such a party, such a vanguard party that would be in advance of the masses, in advance of other political parties, Lenin actively forced a split within the Marxist movement in Russia. The Marxist Social Democrats were split in 1903 at a conference in exile when Lenin led his Bolshevik faction. The word Bolshevik or Bolshevik in Russian means the majority, away from the moderate faction, who were given the name by default of Mensheviks, or the minority Menshevik faction. The very fact that Lenin's smaller group took for itself the name the majority already suggested something about his sharpness in political maneuver. Lenin, however, faced a very serious challenge, and that challenge could be summed up in one word itself. That challenge was Russia. The central problem for Lenin's variant of Marxist ideology was that Russia was pretty much classically unsuited for a revolution according to classic Marxist criteria. According to classical Marxism, a workers' revolution probably had to take place in a country with large numbers of workers and industry. Russia had only started the road towards that industrialization. Lenin responded with an argument that has a lot to do with a buzzword common in our own times, not one that Lenin used himself, with the buzzword of globalization. Lenin responded with a sharp argument that suggested the world was now one globalized whole. He suggested that this had crucial implications, and he summed up his argument in a book that was produced in the time of turmoil of the First World War itself in 1916. This book, entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of World Capitalism, theorized that Russia was the weakest link in a worldwide capitalist imperialist system, and that it was precisely because it was so weak that Russia was precisely the spot in which one should attempt a revolution. In a world crisis, war could be turned into a civil war between classes. Russia was the place to strike because of its weakness and backwardness. The Russian Revolution, however, Lenin emphasized again and again, was not an end in itself, not the end point, not the end station of revolution, but rather the first stage in a revolution that needed to be spread worldwide, globalized, and internationalized. The key to success in Lenin's recipe was his concept of a new type of party. The Bolsheviks would be the vanguard of the masses, leading them, representing the working class that might not yet be conscious of its political mission. Lenin warned that the consequences of not having such a vanguard party could truly be dire. Without a vanguard party, Lenin warned, without a committed revolutionary core leading them, the working class would only fall back on thinking like trade unionists. This was something that Lenin thought of with scorn. He felt that the workers would simply seek short-term gains, would not prepare themselves for their great political mission of revolution, and this truly would be a failure of their historical calling. Lenin's concepts did something very important. They justified the seizure of power by, if necessary, a small group of revolutionaries committed to their cause, viewing clearly their historical task ahead, in the name of the masses, in the name of a working class that was perhaps only coming into being in Russia's beginning of industrialization. After a failed coup attempt in July of 1917, the Bolsheviks prepared for revolt in fall of 1917. They had taken leading positions in the Soviet councils. They felt that they would be able to draw upon that support in their councils to legitimize their rule, and they preached revolutionary defeatism in the war effort. According to Lenin, the worse things get, the better things get for revolutionaries, providing an opportunity. The Bolsheviks took power in an event that they called Red October in 1917. This revolution of Red October, in fact, took place on November 7th by the new Western calendar that was announced and brought into being with the revolution. But this Red October was mythologized and was depicted in heroic terms afterwards. The reality was a little bit different. The revolt was coordinated by Trotsky, as Lenin was in hiding. Small numbers of committed Bolshevik fighters, the Red Guards, stormed the lightly defended Winter Palace in Petrograd, arrested most of the members of the provisional government, and took over the capital with remarkable ease. About 6 lives were lost in this seizure of power in Petrograd itself. Lenin compared it to the ease of lifting a feather. The seizure of power had been easy. Nonetheless, later, the Bolsheviks would later mythologize what they called the Great October Revolution, making it appear a mass event in art and in film. A joke used to circulate that the documentaries that were made afterwards, restagings or recreations of the storming of the Winter Palace, actually had more people who got hurt in the filming of these redemonstrations rather than in the actual event itself. The Bolsheviks announced that they were taking power in the name of the Soviets, not for themselves. But on taking power, they started to consolidate their authority. A council of people's commissars, known by the dauntingly long acronym Sovnarkom, was established. It was made up of members of the Bolshevik Party, including Lenin, Trotsky, and a shadowy figure by the name of Stalin, who would become very prominent in years afterwards, and they were supported by other revolutionaries of a more anarchist stripe, the left socialist revolutionaries. The Bolsheviks soon moved to eliminate other parties, shut down other newspapers, and dismissed the newly democratically elected Constituent Assembly. They were sent packing by Bolshevik sailors who told them the Bolsheviks were in control and their services were not needed. By summer of 1918, the only legal party in Russia was the Communist Party, as the Bolsheviks renamed themselves in March of 1918. They sought to consolidate control over the economy as well. The market was shut down, replaced with state control of internal trade, factories, and land. Lenin tremendously admired Germany's war socialism. He felt the Germans had really hit upon something which he aimed to introduce in Russia as well. A secret police was established on December 17, 1917. Soon after the seizure of power, it was known as the Cheka, which stood for the acronym for the Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Espionage. These Chekists were charged with red terror against counter-revolutionaries and class enemies, drawing on the example of the French Revolution. The beginnings of a concentration camp system were established as well. So-called revolutionary tribunals replaced regular courts. Using the railroad system and armored trains, which they felt were modern and forceful tools, Bolshevik units fanned out across the country to seize control of the vast land. These measures were in line with Lenin's ideas of what had to follow upon a seizure of power, dictatorship, which he defined ringingly and harshly as authority untrammeled by any laws, absolutely unrestricted by any rules whatever, and based directly on force. A total dictatorship to follow upon a total revolution. One can't begin to understand what the Bolsheviks thought they were doing without considering their ideological expectations for the future, their hopes, their expectations for the spread of worldwide revolution. The Bolsheviks always expected that their action in Russia was but the beginning. The action which would unleash a worldwide cascade of proletarian revolutions, especially in the developed economies of Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. To win time for this absolutely essential internationalization or globalization of the revolution, Lenin delivered to ordinary Russians on the promises of peace and land. The Bolsheviks began peace negotiations with Germany. Lenin encouraged peasants to take over estates, which was very nice because that's what they were already doing on their own anyhow, but he simultaneously passed a law nationalizing all land under the control of the government, a sign of the future. At the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Bolsheviks accepted defeat in order to save the revolution. After a truce in December of 1917, the Bolsheviks and the German military had met to negotiate a peace treaty, but they had opposed aims. The Germans wanted territory for an empire in Eastern Europe. The Bolsheviks aimed to use negotiations as a global propaganda event announcing their message worldwide. To sway world public opinion and to embarrass the imperialist powers, the Bolsheviks had revealed the diplomatic secret treaties they'd found in the safes of the Russian Foreign Ministry. When negotiations stalled with the Germans, Trotsky took a gamble. He announced a new tactic. His new tactic, as he walked out of the negotiations, was to claim that the Bolsheviks now recognized neither peace nor war. Nobody was really sure what that meant. Trotsky himself probably didn't know what it meant. It probably sounded better in the early hours of the morning when it had occurred to him that it did in practice, because the Germans, after being befuddled for a moment, simply resumed their advance. They sped forward by train to occupy ever larger parts of Russia. To save the revolution, Lenin convinced his Bolshevik associates to return to the negotiations. He carried the day by explaining to his fellow revolutionaries that this was not an admission of defeat. It was rather a case of taking one step backwards in order to take two steps forward. And thus, on March 3rd, 1918, the Bolsheviks signed the incredibly harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which stripped vast territories from the former Russian Empire, but they felt gave them time for their revolution. In spite of these reverses, and in spite of a brewing civil war, as anti-Bolshevik forces began to muster their energies within Russia, Lenin continued to expect that the international workers' revolution was about to break out. To demonstrate that there was no way back to the days of the old regime before the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks executed in cold blood the imprisoned Tsar, the Emperor of Russia, and his family, shooting them in a cellar in Yekaterinburg on July 16, 1918. As with the French Revolution in its increasingly radical stages, the Bolsheviks were determined to show that their revolution was for good and was moving forward, progressing inexorably. We need to consider, in some sense, the outcome of this revolution in terms of its influence on world politics, both direct influence and indirect influence. The Bolsheviks saw their Red October, as we've stressed, as but the first part of a worldwide process. They now felt it was up to them to seek to export their revolution worldwide. This was not to be simply an event confined to the backward Russian Empire, but rather the unleashing of a much larger catalytic process. And they founded, in March of 1919, an organization which was devoted to this task of export. This was an organization known as the Comintern. This was very characteristic of the Bolsheviks, this love for acronyms, which seemed to suggest bureaucratic efficiency and organization. The Comintern stood for the words, the Communist International. It was also known by the name the Third International because it was intended to supersede previous, the first and second, world socialist organizations known as internationals. The Comintern, founded in Moscow in March of 1919, really functioned as Revolution Incorporated, an export company. Trotsky was proud of this organization and referred to it as the General Staff of the World Revolution. The Bolsheviks, they felt, had simply shown the way. Now it was up to other radical socialists worldwide to follow their lead. The Comintern set about organizing and encouraging communist parties in other countries to follow the Bolshevik example. Such communist parties established in other countries were often made up of those most radical parts of the social democratic wing, the socialist movement, who were encouraged to split off from their earlier socialist comrades and to take the more radical course that the Bolsheviks followed. The aim was to create soon, not in the far-off future, but soon, a worldwide international republic of Soviets, spanning the globe and realizing the dream of worldwide global revolution. The influence of this revolution would also be indirect. We want to consider this as well. Especially after the vast devastation of the First World War, when it finally comes to a close in 1918, this Bolshevik revolution would gain admirers worldwide. Many of these admirers, who felt that this was an example to emulate, saw the Bolshevik Revolution and Great Red October as a beacon of hope and social change. There were also, however, many who viewed the Bolshevik seizure of power as a danger, and they were opponents who would be alarmed by what they saw as the revolutionary processes taking place in communist Russia. Truly, the year 1917, in which the Bolsheviks come to power, was a great dividing line in modern history. Some historians of Europe have called 1917 the beginning of world history in a real political sense. From now on, something new had happened. There now existed in the international system a state which was dedicated to the overthrow of all other governments. The Bolshevik seizure of power was a pivotal event of the century, not just for Russia, but for the world. The challenge of communism would shape the ideological discourse of the 20th century, as all political leaders and governments of the world would have to respond to it. In our next lecture, on the aftermath of World War I, we will see the furious dialectic of attempts both to export this revolution and this ideology worldwide, as well as furious reaction and counter-revolution against this ideology, leading to more political change.